I'm Rachel, 27. My parents demanded I postpone my wedding for nearly a decade so my unemployed brother could figure out his life. So I eloped without telling them. If you were in my shoes at 27, would you have waited or walked away like I did? I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the folder that held our draft invitations. The paper was thick, embossed with pale blue leaves along the border. Ethan and I had chosen them together on a snowy Saturday in February, laughing over font choices and tasting small cakes the bakery sent home for sampling. I should have felt joy every time I opened that folder. But that morning, the paper seemed heavy, as if my parents' words had been stamped across each card. Wait, you cannot marry until Brandon does. 10 years, if necessary. When Ethan slipped into the kitchen, he noticed my clenched jaw. He set a mug of coffee beside me and asked quietly, "Another message from your mom?" I nodded. The night before, my mother had texted, "Family order matters. Rachel, marriage must respect tradition. You will wait until Brandon is ready." Brandon, my 31-year-old brother, had been the golden child since birth. Ivy League graduate. Brilliant ideas. Endless potential, at least according to my parents. Yet for years, he floated from plan to plan, living at home, announcing grand ventures that never survived past a business card mock-up. My parents clung to his promise as if their belief could transform his inertia into momentum. Ethan pulled out the chair across from me. "We've saved nearly $40,000 for this wedding. We've booked the Arboretum. Why do they think they can erase that?" I wished I had an answer. All I could offer was a half smile. Growing up, I had learned that in my family, logic bent around Brandon. My achievements graduating college, landing an accounting job downtown, building an independent life were treated like footnotes. Brandon's vague dreams were headlines. I closed the folder and pushed it aside. On the fridge door hung a magnet-clipped grocery list milk, bread, eggs, and beneath it a sticky note Ethan had left. "This is our life, not theirs." His blocky handwriting steadied me. Still, my parents' voices echoed. I pictured them at their suburban dining table. Carol with her arms crossed, Dennis nodding quietly beside her. "Family order comes first." She had repeated during our last visit. "Your brother is older. The community would talk if you married before him. Do you want to embarrass us?" Embarrass them. That word stung. For years, I had believed my hard work would make them proud. Instead, they feared the whispers of neighbors more than celebrating my happiness. Ethan reached across the table, covering my hand. "Rachel, we can't let them steal this from us. We deserve to move forward." I swallowed hard, watching his ringless finger resting on mine. He was right. We had been engaged since 2020, waiting through pandemic delays, saving diligently. We had a plan, a date, a future, yet my parents clung to their illusion of tradition, as though withholding their blessing could freeze time. Later that day, I walked through our small apartment, touching the objects that marked the life Ethan and I built. The bookshelf we assembled on our first anniversary, the framed photo from a road trip to the North Shore, the stack of bank statements proving every month of saving, each deposit nudging us closer to the Arboretum. These were my artifacts, my proof that adulthood had arrived, despite my parents' refusal to see it. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Mom. "Think carefully. If you rush, you betray family." I set the phone down without answering. That evening, Ethan cooked pasta while I sat with our best friend, chosen as maid of honor, who had stopped by. She flipped through the draft invitations. "These are perfect. Are you seriously considering canceling because of Brandon?" Her bluntness made my throat tighten. I explained the latest ultimatum, how my parents had repeated the decade demand. She shook her head. "You've already waited. How much of your life are you supposed to sacrifice for his?" I looked at Ethan across the kitchen. He stirred sauce slowly, shoulders tense. For years, he had stayed respectful toward my parents. But I knew his patience was thinning. Night fell, and after our friend left, Ethan and I sat on the couch, The glow of the television barely lit the room. He finally said, "We could do it quietly. Just us. Close friends. My parents. You don't need their permission." The thought scared me, but it also lifted a weight. I pictured the Arboretum's garden paths lined with tulips. A quiet ceremony free of judgmental eyes. Still, guilt twisted in me. It would break them. I whispered. Ethan squeezed my hand. "They broke you first." I hardly slept. I lay awake, replaying memories of childhood. Brandon receiving applause for a school play while I was told to keep my voice down. Brandon failing a course and my parents blaming the teacher. Me earning an A and hearing only silence. Those patterns had shaped me into someone who worked harder. Stayed keter. Hoping to be noticed. But marriage was not a grade on a report card. It was the rest of my life. At dawn, I rose and returned to the table. I opened the folder again. Tracing the pale blue leaves on the invitation border, I imagined sliding them into envelopes, addressing them to people who truly supported us. In that moment, I felt clarity. The choice was not between my parents and Brandon. Not even between tradition and rebellion. It was between surrendering the life I had built and protecting it. When Ethan woke, I met him in the kitchen. "We're going to marry," I said firmly. He studied my face, then smiled with relief. "With or without them?" "With or without them," I answered. He wrapped his arms around me, the smell of coffee lingering on his shirt. For the first time in months, my chest loosened. That day, we began sketching a new plan. The Arboretum was still booked, but the guest list would shrink. No distant relatives expecting a show of tradition. Only those who understood us. My maid of honor, Ethan's parents, a few close friends. As I wrote names in neat columns on a yellow legal pad, I felt both grief and liberation. Grief for the family I wished I had. Liberation for the life I was choosing anyway. I placed the pad beside the folder. Two artifacts side by side, evidence of a boundary drawn. Looking at those papers, I realized a quiet wedding would be louder than any protest. It would say I am more than a daughter in the shadow of a golden child. I am Rachel, and I choose my own life. The year was 2015, and I was 18 when I first stepped onto the campus of the University of Minnesota. The air smelled faintly of leaves and asphalt, and students carried backpacks weighed down by brand new textbooks. I felt both terrified and determined. For me, college was not just a chance at education, it was a promise of freedom. At home in the suburb where my parents lived, Brandon still dominated every conversation. He was 22, freshly back from the Ivy League, with a diploma that my parents displayed like a crown jewel. I was proud of him at first, but quickly I saw the cracks. He talked endlessly about startups and future empires. But I noticed he never stayed in one job for more than a few months. He moved back in with Carol and Dennis, claiming he needed time to launch the big idea. Whenever I called home with updates and A on my midterm, a new part-time job at the library, my mother's voice always shifted back to Brandon. "He's meeting investors soon," she would say. "He might change the whole industry." My 4 years at Minnesota taught me more than accounting. They taught me how it felt to be invisible in my own family. I worked 2 part-time jobs to supplement what my parents had given me. Nearly $25,000 toward tuition. That money, they reminded me often, was a sacrifice they made to keep me afloat. Brandon, on the other hand, received unspoken credit for simply existing. When his ventures collapsed, my parents soothed him with words of encouragement. When I pulled 18-hour study days, they warned me not to stress too much because they assumed my success was guaranteed. It was during senior year, in 2018, that I met Ethan. We both reached for the same cup of bad coffee in the student union and laughed about the long line lice. He was already planning to enter an MBA program, and he carried himself with quiet focus. We began studying together, sharing notes and late-night meals from campus food trucks. Ethan noticed quickly that I never mentioned my family with warmth. One evening, as we worked through a cost accounting problem set, he asked, "Why do you look sad every time you bring up your parents?" I told him about Brandon, about the golden child pedestal, about how my parents measured everything in terms of how it affected him. Ethan listened without interrupting, then said simply, "That sounds exhausting. You deserve more space to be seen." His words startled me, because no one in my family had ever said anything close. Graduation in 2018 felt like stepping out of one world into another. My parents came, of course, but their smiles were tight. Brandon attended too, boasting to relatives about his next project while I stood in my cap and gown, clutching the diploma that proved my independence. I still remember the group photo after the ceremony. My parents stood beside Brandon, beaming. I was placed at the edge, holding my rolled diploma like a prop. Later that night, Ethan sent me the picture with a text. "You're the one with the real achievement here. Don't let them crop you out in your own story." That message became a quiet anchor during my first months working downtown at an accounting firm. The transition from student to professional was rough. My cubicle overlooked a row of buses, and the fluorescent lights often gave me headaches. But I felt pride every payday, seeing my name on a check I had earned without help. Brandon, meanwhile, continued pitching vague businesses at Sunday dinners. He held forth about apps that would revolutionize finance or transform real estate. While I quietly passed the breadbasket, my parents asked me no questions about my clients, my exams, or the certifications I was pursuing. Instead, they leaned forward eagerly at Brandon's words, nodding at every phrase. I would sometimes bring Ethan along, hoping they might see the seriousness of our relationship. He always dressed neatly, shook their hands firmly, and tried to talk about his studies. My parents responded politely, but soon turned back to Brandon. In 2020, Ethan proposed. It was a quiet evening in our small apartment near campus. He had cooked dinner, and after dessert, he handed me a simple ring, saying, "I want to build a life with you, not just chase one." I said yes without hesitation. It was the most certain I had ever felt. When I called my parents with the news, there was a long pause. Then my mother said, "Well, let's hope Brandon meets someone soon, too. It would be strange if you married first." I hung up the phone that night with my stomach sinking. Instead of celebrating, I had been measured once again against my brother's non-existent progress. I kept working, moving slowly up in responsibility at the firm. While Ethan advanced in his MBA program, we supported each other with small rituals, shared dinners, budget spreadsheets, weekend hikes. Together, we started saving even before we had a set wedding date. Every time I added to the savings folder, I felt both excitement and dread, wondering whether my parents would ever accept it. Brandon's life remained unchanged. He still lived at home, still circling through ideas. My parents still described him as on the verge. They never used words like that for me, even though my life was actually moving forward. One evening, Ethan and I sat with friends who asked about our plans. I confessed that my parents were lukewarm, almost dismissive. Ethan put his arm around me and said, "Then we'll plan for ourselves. We can't live for their approval." In that moment, I realized something vital. For years, I had chased their recognition like a child seeking praise. But recognition was never coming. Not while Brandon's shadow stretched over every room. By the time 2020 arrived, I was engaged, employed, and living independently. Yet in my parents' eyes, I was still a placeholder until Brandon succeeded. What I didn't know was how far they would go to enforce that illusion and how hard I would have to fight for my own future. By 2021, I had been engaged for a year. The ring on my finger caught light at odd times while typing at the office, while brushing my hair before bed. It reminded me of the promise Ethan and I had made, even when my parents' silence made that promise feel like rebellion. Ethan and I had begun saving immediately. Each month, we moved a portion of our paychecks into a dedicated account. I kept a spreadsheet printed and tucked in a folder, with neat columns of deposits. By the end of 2023, we had accumulated nearly $40,000. That folder, worn at the edges, felt heavier than any trophy from childhood. It was proof that our life was real, independent, and deliberate. We lived in a modest apartment near downtown Minneapolis, The kitchen counters were chipped, the carpet faded, but every corner carried our effort. I often cooked while Ethan studied late into the night for his MBA courses. Our shared table, covered in textbooks and receipts. We laughed about living like students again. But underneath was pride. No one else was paying for this. No one else was steering our ship. My parents never asked about those nights. They asked instead whether Brandon had called me. He's networking, my mother would say with excitement. He might launch something big soon. Each time, I bit my tongue. I wanted to say he's 30 and unemployed. We're the ones building a future. But silence felt safer, even as it gnawed at me. In 2022, Ethan and I visited the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. It was a bright autumn day, the leaves blazing red and gold. We walked along the garden paths, and I imagined us standing there with friends, reciting vows under the open sky. We placed a deposit that day, my hands shaking as I signed. Back home, I slid the receipt into the wedding folder, behind the spreadsheet of savings. Two artifacts layered together, evidence that we were moving forward. Family dinners grew more difficult. At the long oak table in my parents' suburban home, Brandon always had the floor. He described apps that would change how people invested, or ventures that required mysterious seed capital. My parents leaned in, eyes shining. When Ethan tried to join conversation mentioning his classes, asking about their garden, they responded politely, then returned to Brandon. One evening, I brought up our plans. We've booked the Arboretum, I said carefully. My mother set down her fork. Rachel, it's not the right time. You know Brandon hasn't settled yet. My father added softly. Marriage should respect the natural order. Ethan's jaw tightened. With respect. Our marriage isn't about order. It's about us. The table fell silent. Brandon cleared his throat and began talking about venture capital. And just like that, my parents' attention shifted away. Later, as we drove home, Ethan gripped the steering wheel. They're never going to see you. Rachel, not as you are, only as someone who should wait. I stared out the window at the passing lights. I keep hoping if I show them enough proof, they'll understand. Proof doesn't work when they don't want it, he said quietly. In 2023, the pressure increased. My mother sent a string of messages. Remember who helped you with college? $25,000 doesn't come from nowhere. Family sacrifices mean you owe patience. I read those words at my desk during lunch break. My sandwich sat untouched. For years, I had carried gratitude for their support. But in that moment, gratitude curdled into a weapon. That evening, I pulled out the savings folder. I showed Ethan the spreadsheet, the Arboretum receipt, the growing balance. This is what we did ourselves, I said. He placed his hand over mine. This is the only proof that matters. We continued planning in secret, shrinking the guest list, choosing details that felt authentic. My maid of honor joined us in cafes, sketching ideas on napkins. We laughed about colors, flowers, playlists. These small acts became Defiant's key. Steady, unstoppable. Meanwhile, my parents grew sharper in tone. Phone calls ended in accusations. You are selfish. My mother hissed once. You're supposed to support your brother. I hung up shaking, then turned to Ethan. Maybe I am selfish, but isn't that what building a life means, choosing your own joy? He kissed my forehead. If that's selfish, then let's be selfish together. The savings folder remained on our shelf, surrounded by textbooks and framed photos. Each time I opened it, I felt a surge of pride and a stab of sorrow. Pride because we had built something real. Sorrow because the people who should have cheered for me instead saw betrayal. Yet even in that tension, I sensed change inside me. I was no longer a daughter begging for recognition. I was a woman documenting her own progress, collecting artifacts of independence. By the end of 2023, our future was sketched in deposits and receipts, in notes on napkins, in whispered plans. My parents thought they held control. but I held the folder that proved otherwise. The question was how long I could carry it before breaking. Late in 2023, the leaves had fallen in Minneapolis, leaving branches bare against gray skies. Ethan and I drove to my parents' house for what I hoped would be a civil conversation. My stomach tightened as we pulled up to the driveway. I knew the script, but I still hoped for a change in tone. Inside, the dining room table was already set with coffee mugs and a plate of cookies. My mother folded her arms the moment I sat down. My father, Gieter, looked at his hands. Brandon leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded, as though bored. Carol began. Rachel, we've thought about this carefully. You cannot marry until Brandon does. That means postponing. At least 10 years if necessary. The words landed like ice water. 10 years, I asked. Stunned. Yes, she said firmly. Family order must be respected. Brandon is older. People will talk if you cross that line. I turned to my brother. You're 31. Don't you think it's time you stand on your own? He shrugged. I'm working on things. But your rushing makes me look bad. Ethan's voice cut in. Low but sharp. This is absurd. Rachel and I have waited long enough. The air grew thick. My mother's eyes narrowed. We sacrificed $25,000 for your education. Rachel, you owe this family patience. My father added quietly. It's not just about you. It's about all of us. Heat rose in my chest. I wanted to scream that our $40,000 in savings was not theirs, that our future was not collateral for Brandon's indecision. Instead, I sat frozen, fingers pressing into the edge of my planner. Ethan reached under the table and squeezed my hand. We're leaving, he said, back at our apartment. I opened the planner and stared at the notes I had scribbled guest lists. Flower options. Vows half-written. Tears blurred the ink. Ethan sat beside me. Rachel, they will never let go. If we wait for approval, we'll wait forever. I whispered. But if we go ahead, I'll lose them. He tilted me chin. You already lost their approval, but you haven't lost yourself. Which matters more? I looked at the vow drafts scattered across the table. Pale sheets with phrases crossed out and rewritten. They weren't polished yet, but they were ours. Unlike the endless demands of my parents, these words belonged to me. In the weeks that followed, I tried again to reason with them. Phone calls ended with accusations. Selfish. My mother repeated. You are betraying your brother. Once, after a particularly sharp exchange, I found a text from Ethan waiting when I got home. We're doing this our way. I saved the message, scrolling back to it whenever doubt crept in. By January 2024, hors décision solidifie. The guest list shrank to a handful. My maid of honor, Ethan's parents, a few friends. The Arboretum deposit held firm. The garden would be ours that spring. One evening, I sat with my maid of honor in a coffee shop near campus. I showed her the planner, the vow drafts. She listened, then said, Rachel, you're choosing yourself for the first time. That's not betrayal. That's survival. Her words anchored me. At home, Ethan and I placed the vow drafts beside the wedding folder, stacking proof of our independence. He pointed at them and said, Every page is a step away from their control. I nodded. Then, let's keep writing. We spent that night shaping sentences, laughing at awkward phrases, crying at the weight of what we promised. Outside, snow fell in thick silence. Inside, we were building something unbreakable. The final call from my mother came a week later. Her voice cracked with anger. If you do this without us, don't expect forgiveness. I held the phone, heart pounding, then said simply, I'm not asking for forgiveness. And I ended the call. That night, staring at the glowing brochure of the Arboretum on our kitchen table, I felt both grief and relief. Our wedding would be everything we wanted, and nothing they could take away. Early spring in Minneapolis carried the scent of thawing earth and wet pavement. The snow melted in patches, revealing grass that had been buried for months. I looked out from our apartment window, thinking about how much had changed since winter. The silence from my parents was deafening. After our final call in January, they stopped reaching out. No texts, no emails, no Sunday invitations. Brandon's shadow still loomed. Friends told me he was pitching another big plan, though no one saw results. But in my daily life, they were simply absent. Ethan noticed my quiet moods. One evening, he set a thick binder on the table. Smiling. Our wedding book, he said. Inside were pages of contracts, receipts, ideas clipped from magazines. At the front, he had slipped the Arboretum receipt, the proof of our deposit. I flipped through, touched by the care. You've made this feel real. I whispered. It is real. He answered. It's ours. A week later, we visited his parents in their cozy home just outside Minneapolis. The smell of roast chicken filled the kitchen, and laughter echoed as his mother handed me a plate. Unlike my own parents, Ethan's welcomed me with warmth that left me blinking back tears. After dinner, Ethan's mom pulled me aside. She pressed a hand on mine and said softly, "Don't let anyone tell you your happiness is wrong. We're proud of you both." Her words were a balm I hadn't known I needed. Later, when she texted me, "We're excited to celebrate you. Rachel." I saved the message. It felt like a counterweight to every accusation I had endured. Back home, I sat with my maid of honor at a coffee shop. Our notebooks spread across the table. She sketched flower arrangements while I listed names for our shortened guest list. It was only a handful now, those who truly mattered. Your parents might not show, she said gently, but look at what you do have. I glanced at her page filled with tulip doodles. I'm realizing that's enough. More than enough. Still, there were moments of ache. At night, I lay awake wondering if I should call again. Try once more to repair what felt broken beyond mending. But each time, I remembered my mother's voice. 10 years. Wait until Brandon does. That demand was not a bridge to reconciliation. It was a wall I could never climb. Ethan often found me staring at the wedding binder. He would sit beside me and say, "You're not alone in this. We're writing a new story, page by page." And slowly, I began to believe him. Spring crept closer. The city's streets dried, and small buds appeared on trees. With each change of season, my resolve deepened. I carried the wedding binder with me to work, flipping through pages during lunch breaks. In its neat sections, receipts, contracts, guest lists, I found a rhythm of independence. One afternoon, a colleague glanced at the binder and asked, "Your parents must be thrilled." He hesitated, then said quietly, "Some people aren't meant to be part of every chapter." Meanwhile, gossip about Brandon reached me through distant relatives. He was apparently planning a new company, talking about millions in venture funding. No one had seen a business plan, yet my parents clung to his promises, their pride unshaken. I stopped comparing. Each time I added a note to the binder, I reminded myself my life was tangible, lived, documented. His was always almost, never actual. A week before the wedding, Ethan and I sat on the floor of our apartment surrounded by envelopes. We addressed invitations by hand, laughing at misspellings. I felt calm, even joyful. I looked at Ethan and said, "For the first time, I don't feel like I'm waiting. I'm choosing." He kissed me lightly. "That's the difference. Waiting is what they wanted. Choosing is what we do." As I slid the last envelope into a stack, I realized the distance from my parents hurt less than it once had. The binder beside me, thick with our plans, felt heavier than their silence. For the first time, I felt lighter, like I was walking toward a future of my own, making land. The morning of our wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of spring day that felt borrowed from summer. Sunlight streamed through the apartment blinds as I buttoned the dress. My maid of honor helped me choose. It was simple ivory fabric, a soft neckline. Nothing ostentatious. I wanted elegance, not spectacle. Ethan waited at the arboretum, his suit pressed, his tie, a shade of blue that matched the flowers blooming along the garden paths. As our car pulled in, my breath caught. The arboretum stretched out in waves of color tulips and daffodils swaying gently, trees budding overhead. It looked exactly as I had imagined when we placed that first deposit. Only now it was real. The ceremony began with the soft rustle of chairs, friends settling into rows. My maid of honor squeezed my hand. "This is it," she whispered. Music drifted through the garden as I walked down the aisle. My shoes clicked softly against the stone path. The scent of blossoms thick in the air. At the end, Ethan waited, his smile steady, his eyes bright. I glanced briefly at the seats where my parents might have been. Empty. The ache was sharp but fleeting, drowned out by the warmth of those who were present. Ethan's parents beamed, his father dabbing his eyes. Friends smiled, some holding phones discreetly, capturing moments. We exchanged vows. We had written ourselves, scribbled first in drafts late at night, now smoothed into promises. Ethan's voice was firm, steady. "I will choose you every day. Not because it is easy, but because it is us." My own voice trembled. "I have spent my life waiting for permission. With you, I need none. I promise to walk forward, always beside you." When we slipped rings onto each other's fingers, the weight was slight, but the meaning immense. Applause rippled across the garden as we kissed, sunlight glinting off the metal bands. After the ceremony, we moved to a rustic hall within the arboretum. Wooden beams crossed overhead, and candles flickered along the tables. Dinner was simple but heartfelt: roast chicken, vegetables, fresh bread. Laughter filled the space, echoing louder than any silence my parents had left behind. Ethan's father rose for a toast. He raised his glass, voice thick with emotion. "Rachel, you are family, not because of today, but because of who you've been to Ethan for years. We're proud to witness your life together." I swallowed back tears. Those words, spoken by someone who had no obligation, carried more weight than all the approval my parents withheld. My maid of honor spoke next, recalling late nights of study sessions and whispered dreams. She looked at me, eyes shining. "You've always been strong, Rachel, even when you doubted it. Today proves it." Laughter and clinking glasses followed. For once, every word spoken about me felt true, not diminished, not compared. As the evening waned, Ethan and I stepped outside. The sky had turned deep blue, stars faintly visible. We walked the garden path hand in hand, still wearing our wedding clothes. The air smelled of lilacs. "This is ours," Ethan said softly. I nodded, leaning into him. "No one can take this day." We stood there a long while, letting silence hold us. Later, as guests departed, candid photos began to circulate on phones. Friends shared snapshots: Ethan and me, laughing over cake, holding hands during vows, spinning on the dance floor. I saved a few to my own phone, treasuring them already. I imagined someday flipping through a wedding album, showing our children, telling them how love triumphed over noise. That night, back in our apartment, the binder still sat on the shelf. I added the vow cards and tucked a handful of photos inside. The binder was no longer just plans. It was a record of something accomplished. For the first time in years, I went to bed without dread. My parents' voices were absent, and yet the quiet felt full. As I drifted to sleep, Ethan's ring warm against my finger. I thought joy does not need an audience. It only needs truth. And today, truth belonged to us. A few weeks after the wedding, I sat at our apartment table flipping through candid photos. Friends had sent us images: Ethan and me laughing over cake, holding hands during vows, swaying to music under the arboretum lights. Each picture made me smile. Then my phone buzzed. A notification lit up. I had been tagged in an album on Facebook. Another friend had uploaded our photos, dozens of them, and tagged Ethan and me. Within minutes, comments appeared, likes multiplying. For a brief moment, I was glad. People could see the joy we had built. But then another notification came, my mother's name flashing across the screen. I opened the message. Rachel, how could you? More followed in quick succession. You embarrassed us. You betrayed family. You ruined your brother's future. I sat frozen, scrolling. The words blurred together, heavy with rage. Ethan looked up from the couch. What's wrong? I handed him the phone. His eyes darkened as he read. Rachel, this isn't about you marrying. It's about control. They lost it, and they can't stand it. That night, the phone didn't stop buzzing. Voicemails piled up. My father's voice, low but firm. You have shamed us. People will talk. You have no idea what you've done to Brandon. Brandon himself left a message, his tone dripping with wounded pride. You couldn't wait. You ruined everything. Who's going to take me seriously now? When my own sister undercut me, I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but the ache in my chest kept me quiet. I opened the family group chat. Dozens of messages scrolled by. Aunts and uncles weighed in, some echoing my parents' anger, others silent. One cousin sent a thumbs-up emoji on a photo, only to be scolded by my mother. I took screenshots, each one a shard of proof. Not because I needed to share them, but because they reminded me I wasn't imagining the cruelty. Ethan sat beside me, scrolling too. Look at this, he said, showing me a message from his mom. Don't let them crush you. We're proud of you both. The contrast nearly broke me. On one side, fury and blame. On the other, unconditional acceptance. Over the next week, the storm continued. Relatives called to mediate, suggesting I apologize. My mother left another voicemail. Voice rising with each word. You have destroyed your brother's reputation. Do you even care? He will never recover now. I stared at the phone, finally hitting delete. I'm done listening, I said aloud. Ethan nodded. Good. They're not asking for reconciliation. Rachel, they're demanding submission. We sat together in silence, the weight of years pressing down, yet underneath was a strange calm. For the first time, their anger didn't dictate my choices. One evening, I stood by the window, Minneapolis lights glowing outside. My phone buzzed again. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I whispered to Ethan. They can shout all they want, but they can't unwrite what we already lived. He wrapped his arm around me. That's quiet justice. Rachel, living well, without their permission. I scrolled through our photos once more, me in my dress. Ethan smiling. Friends, raising glasses. Proof of a day that existed, no matter who denied it. Proof that happiness had bloomed, even in the absence of those who should have stood beside me. For once, their words didn't decide my life. They only proved I had chosen right. By the summer of 2024, life in Minneapolis had settled into a rhythm. Our apartment felt different, somehow lighter. The binder sat on its shelf, thick now, with vow cards, photos, and receipts. I sometimes flipped through it on quiet evenings. Not to plan, but to remember. Ethan and I built routines, shared breakfasts before work, weekend walks around the lakes, dinners with his parents. Every time we stepped into their home, I felt welcomed in a way I had never known with my own family. His mother often hugged me at the door. His father asked about my clients at the firm. And no one mentioned Brandon or obligations or order. My own parents remained silent. Weeks passed without a word. Brandon posted vague updates, online photos of coffee cups, captions about big meetings, but no real progress. Through distant relatives, I heard he still lived at home, still talking more than doing. Once, an aunt reached out quietly. I saw your photos, she said over the phone. You looked happy. That's what matters. Her voice carried a softness I hadn't expected. It reminded me that silence in the family group chat didn't always mean disapproval. Sometimes it meant quiet agreement, hidden beneath fear of confrontation. One afternoon, my maid of honor and I sat in a coffee shop, the same place we had planned flowers months earlier. She pulled up a photo on her phone. Me and Ethan walking hand in hand under the arboretum trees. "This is my favorite," she said. I studied the picture. My shoulders were relaxed, my smile unguarded. "It doesn't even look like me," I murmured. "It looks exactly like you," she replied, just without the weight. Her words sank deep. I realized I no longer measured myself against my parents' approval. For the first time, I saw myself as whole without it. At home, Ethan found me looking through the binder again. He leaned over my shoulder, pointing at the vow cards. "We should frame these," he said. I nodded. "They're proof that we chose ourselves." We did frame them, hanging them in the hallway by our bedroom. Each time I passed, I felt grounded. My parents' silence lingered, but it no longer controlled me. I thought of all the years I had begged for recognition, only to be pushed aside for Brandon. That chapter had ended. Not neatly, not with reconciliation, but with distance. Sometimes I wondered if they looked at our photos online, if they scrolled in secret. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. Either way, it no longer mattered. One evening, Ethan and I sat on the apartment balcony, the city lights flickering in the distance. He asked, "Do you ever regret it doing it our way?" I considered carefully. I regret that they couldn't come, but I don't regret losing us. For once, I stopped waiting, and life didn't end. It began. He smiled, pulling me close. Then we did it right. The binder remains, thick and weighty, a symbol of more than just a wedding. It holds the story of independence, of breaking free from silence and demands. And every time I pass the framed vows, I remind myself, permission is not required for happiness. My story doesn't end with reconciliation. It ends with freedom, the kind that comes quietly, without applause. But deeply, undeniably mine. Looking back now, what stays with me is not the shouting or the silence. It is the calm I found when I stopped asking for permission. For years, I bent myself to fit a family order that was never meant for me. And yet, the moment Ethan and I chose to move forward, life opened wide. I keep the binder still, not as a plan, but as a record. Inside are vow cards, receipts, and photographs evidence that even without the people I once longed to please, joy bloomed anyway. Sometimes I flip through those pages and smile, realizing they mark the first time I wrote my own story without apology. The lesson I carry is simple: family may shape us, but they do not define the limits of our lives. Approval is not the same as love, and silence is not the same as failure. Building a future is not selfish. It is necessary. So, if you've ever faced a choice between waiting for recognition and moving ahead for yourself, I wonder, what did you choose? Did you stay in place? Or did you take that step? I'd love to hear your reflections in the comments. And if my story resonated with you, consider following along. There are more stories like this one, where quiet choices speak louder than any fight. Story 2. My sister received my parents' entire estate because I was too self-sufficient. My grandfather then cut them all out of his will after shocking everyone by writing me a $2 million check during the family dinner. That night, I felt a knot of uneasiness twist in my stomach as I arrived at my parents' house. It was one of those infrequent family get-togethers where everyone tried to be present, dressed to impress, and prepared with courteous but somewhat forced small talk. Why was the meeting held? A subject that had been lingering unspoken for years? My parents had alluded to talking about the future of their personal estate. However, I wasn't holding my breath. I rarely left these situations feeling anything other than marginalized. If history had taught me anything, Tanya, my sister, was already the center of attention, enjoying the praise from everyone. She had that smug smile on her face, as if she knew something we didn't. I felt the familiar sting of being overshadowed as I watched her. My parents had always spoiled, admired, and excused Tanya because she was their golden child. However, I had discovered early on that my only resources were hard work and independence. As the formalities continued, my father clinked his glass, demanding attention. Just as I was wondering if it would be too obvious to sneak out, I was instantly suspicious of my mother as she stood next to him, her face glimmering with excitement, speaking about family legacy and how much they valued our bloodline's future. They made a big splash at the start of their announcement. Every word made my nerves tense as I listened. Then the bombshell was dropped. Tanya was going to inherit their whole estate. Not even a tiny portion. Not even half. For me, as I tried to understand their logic, my ears rang. My father claimed that because Tanya was the younger sibling, she required more assistance, as though her advanced age prevented her from being able to support herself. In response, my mother praised Tanya's alleged future plans and the ways the estate would enable her to realize them. Then, almost as a last resort, they turned to me and said they thought I was capable of handling things on my own, as if my years of toiling away had been in vain. My father even went so far as to say that if I wanted success, I should put in more effort. I had the impression that the room was closing in on me. I was able to inquire as to why they believed this. To be fair, I tried to sound calm, but my voice sounded shaky, with a patronizing smile. My father dismissed my worries and waved me away. It wasn't about fairness, he said. It was about looking out for the family's best interests. Naturally, Tanya couldn't help but apply salt to the wound. She made some sarcastic remarks about how her ambitious plans had earned her this and that. I didn't need to handle the estate's management, although she spoke in a sweet, syrupy tone. Her words were sharp and went deeper than I could have imagined. I wanted to yell at them, demand answers, and express how their choice made me feel alienated within my own family. However, what was the purpose? No amount of reasoning could change the fact that I had been pushed aside once more. They had already made up their minds. The rest of the room, obviously uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene, watched in awkward silence. Extended family members gave me a few pitying looks, but none of them raised their voices. As my parents and Tanya reveled in their own self-congratulation, I sat there feeling shocked and ashamed. The awkward silence that followed a bombshell that no one saw coming filled the room. My parents' announcement was still registering in my mind. Sitting across from me, Tanya practically radiated smugness. Her face was etched with triumph. I wanted to get away from the oppressive stress. However, my grandfather cleared his throat before I could move. It was a tiny sound, but it cut like a blade through the tension. Everybody looked at him. I had assumed he was uninterested because he had sat at the far end of the table and been silent the entire evening. He looked at my parents with a calm intensity that conveyed a warning. But now his expression was sharp. He claimed to have heard enough. Despite being steady, his voice had a distinct weight. My grandfather raised a hand and silenced my father as he tried to object, saying something about it not being his place. "This charade has gone on long enough," he said, telling my father to let him finish. As he took a checkbook out of his jacket pocket, there was a general mutter of bewilderment. I wasn't totally sure why my heart was racing. He scribbled something on a check with purposeful motions, got up, and approached me. He put it in my quivering palms. He claimed that the check was a $2 million personal gift for me, with a sense of finality. His voice reverberated throughout the room. Everyone appeared to be frozen. No one spoke or moved for a moment. I looked incredulously at the bill, the gesture's weight becoming more apparent. It was Tanya who broke the silence first. She demanded to know what was happening in a high-pitched voice. She complained about unfairness and questioned why I was receiving this money while she was not. Grandpa's eyes met hers, piercing and unblinking. He advised her to have a proper conversation about fairness if she wanted to. Everyone sat up straighter as he spoke in a clipped tone, full of controlled anger. His voice rose a little as he turned to speak to my parents. He claimed to have ignored all the work I had put in to succeed in life and to have watched them cuddle Tanya for years, allowing her selfishness. My father's face contorted in discomfort, and my mother's face turned red with shame. Grandpa abruptly interrupted them as they began to murmur something about Tanya being younger and in need of more assistance. He claimed that age was irrelevant. This was about character, he said, pointing out their obvious favoritism. He pointed to Tanya and claimed that they had made her feel so entitled that she believed the world owed her everything. Tanya tried to defend herself as she gasped in shock. She asserted that even though no one had noticed, she had put in a lot of effort. Grandpa gave her a fierce look and asked her to mention something she had really put a lot of effort into. He emphasized that all he had witnessed was her wasting their funds and making fictitious claims about plans she never carried out. He claimed that she was more naive than he had assumed if she took that hard work into account. Grandpa waved my parents away when they attempted to retort that they had the right to make decisions regarding their own estate. He declared that he was free to make his own decisions and that they were free to make theirs. He clarified that the money was intended for me as a thank you for my integrity and tenacity, which he had always admired, but infrequently witnessed in this family. It was the validation, not the money, that made my eyes water. Someone had finally acknowledged my worth, my struggles, and my efforts, unable to control her feelings. Tanya slammed her hands on the table and demanded that Grandpa repeat his explanation. This, she insisted, was an insult to the whole family, not just to herself. She said I had somehow coerced him into giving me the money and accused him of favoritism. My face burned with annoyance. Manipulation. I was the one who was manipulating them after spending years in silence while they showed obvious favoritism and consistently rejected my efforts. In an attempt to persuade Grandpa to change his mind, my parents raised their voices in support of Tanya. According to my father, giving me this kind of reward would needlessly split the family. My mother countered that Tanya needed guidance rather than punishment because she was still a young child. They were blatantly hypocritical in their remarks. I'd had enough. I wouldn't keep quiet. This so-called division, I informed them, had always been there, but they had disregarded it because it worked for them. I pointed out to them how they had disparaged me for choosing to put in a lot of work while congratulating Tanya for doing nothing. They had just given her their entire estate under the guise of fairness. So I questioned how they could stand there and call me avaricious. Tanya retaliated by accusing me of being petty and ungrateful, saying that I was envious of her success. Achievement. I gave her a sour laugh and informed her that relying on handouts and expecting more was not a sign of success but rather of entitlement. Tanya lost it during the argument, yelling that I had always been envious of her and that life was unfair. In an attempt to blame me for things getting worse, my parents said I should have just been thankful for what I had. Grandpa took over once more at that point. The room fell silent as he raised his voice louder than I had ever heard it. After years of cultivating this toxic dynamic, he told my parents they had no right to discuss fairness or family unity. He cautioned Tanya that her entitlement would be her undoing and reminded her that nothing in life was guaranteed. Everyone was hurt by his remarks, including me, but for different reasons. This was no longer just about the money. I realized as the room fell silent again, it was all about being heard and seen at last. Naturally, Tanya was unable to let it go. She complained that it was unjust. She inquired as to whether she didn't also deserve something, when Grandpa informed her that she had already been given everything on a silver platter, and she continued to complain. His tone became cold. She was fortunate, he said, that he hadn't completely taken away my parents' inheritance and given it to me. Chaos broke out in the room. My parents were yelling. The rest of the family was whispering wildly among themselves. And Tanya was about to cry. Grandpa maintained his composure and made his point. He turned to face me and put a firm hand on my shoulder before he left. Without saying anything more, he left the room after telling me to spend the money carefully. There was a stunned silence after his departure. I want to keep the check. Even though nothing could undo the years of abuse or neglect, what ought I to do? One update. It had been a week since that tumultuous family get-together, and the weight remained. The argument wasn't the only thing that persisted. It was the fallout, the actual effect of all that had transpired. I was still digesting what I had said to my parents. The way they treated me like I was unimportant, as though my sister's entitlement was greater than all the years of hard work I had put in. It hurt. My grandfather then arrived at my door one afternoon. He was unexpected, but his presence gave me a sense of peace I wasn't aware I needed. He surveyed the small living room before turning to face me, as though he had a fresh perspective on me. He never wanted to get caught up in the drama and always exuded a certain quiet sophistication. But this time he wasn't holding back, although he didn't say much when he entered. His presence was firm. After a brief pause, he spoke a bit more softly than usual. After everything that had transpired, he told me he simply wanted to see how I was doing. It wasn't until he said it that I realized how much I needed to hear it. I exhaled, half sighing, half laughing, and informed him that I was doing as well as one could hope. Of course, it had been difficult, but I was getting by. I kept it brief because I didn't want to tell him everything. I didn't want to think about the hurt that was still there too much. He refrained from pushing. He simply gave me an understanding nod before giving me a serious look. He claimed that he ought to have intervened earlier and exposed my parents' treatment of me, pointing out how they consistently elevated my sister while ignoring my efforts. His words were sincere, but it was difficult to hear. I informed him that I hadn't anticipated his intervention. I had come to terms with the fact that I had always known their nature. However, it still hurt, especially now that I realize how little they gave me any thought. Grandpa gave another nod. He had a gentle face. He advised me to stop allowing them to determine my value, that everything that was coming to me was something I had earned. Then he quietly informed me that I didn't have to continue trying to win their approval. Now I had an opportunity, a genuine opportunity, to use the money he had given me to create something for myself. He said that I was in charge of my own destiny and that it was up to me to decide how I would spend that money. However, I questioned him about how to proceed and whether using that money was truly acceptable. What if I made a mistake? What would I do with it all if I had no idea? He grinned at me with that accustomed, patient wisdom, not in a patronizing manner. He advised me to take my time, consider my options, and ask for assistance when necessary, rather than worrying about squandering it. He would support me at every turn and offer guidance if I asked for it. We talked about my options, investments, and what I could do with the $2 million for a few more hours. He advised me to seek out mentorship opportunities, advised me to meet with a financial advisor, and urged me to continue learning. We talked, and even though I had a lot to process, I felt lighter. I was not alone in this. Someone was on my side, and he genuinely had faith in me. In a rare show of affection, he placed a hand on my shoulder as he got up to go. He assured me that he had always been proud of me, and that I should always remember that. The second update. After 4 months, things had undoubtedly changed. My sister was already in over her head after seizing complete control of the estate. She was able to ruin what should have been a seamless transition, which I never would have predicted. It wasn't even that she lacked the means. She was presented with everything on a silver platter. However, I suppose that when everything is provided for you, there is no motivation to ensure its longevity. She first made the decision to sell off the majority of the family's assets, stating that this was done to upgrade the estate. In order to redecorate, a cousin told me she had sold off a lot of old furniture items that had been in the family for many years, as well as the remodeling. Well, she promised the world to the most extravagant and expensive contractors. They did half the work and took her money. She was so obstinate that she would not listen to anyone who advised her to slow down and make plans for the future. In the meantime, the debt began to mount. When the money was getting low, she was completely unaware of it. Naturally, my parents were still unaware of her shortcomings. They persisted in defending her, arguing that the family ought to be more understanding and that she was trying her hardest. To be honest, though, I wasn't shocked. Not in a dramatic fashion. Word of what was happening spread quickly. But people began talking as usual. My family's financial difficulties began to surface in unexpected places. After learning about the situation, some of the business partners had withdrawn. The members of my extended family who had previously praised my parents for their stability started to distance themselves. Being attached to someone who couldn't even defend themselves wasn't something they were interested in. I kept getting brief updates about how she had blown a contract with a contractor, or how she had wasted a whole month on consultants who provided no clear guidance and broke the bank. Seeing it was embarrassing. However, I couldn't help but feel a little smug. I knew she would eventually have to face the fact that she couldn't handle what had been handed to her. The worst part, though, was learning that my parents had attempted to hide financial records and act as though nothing had happened. They were already making an effort to pretend that nothing had happened, that their treasured possession had not fallen apart in front of the entire world. I didn't attend the fallout. I was not required to be. I had left that circus a long time ago. However, I did occasionally receive calls from family members inquiring about the family. Some even called my sister unlucky and offered their condolences for the way things had gone wrong. Not only was the family's reputation damaged, it was completely destroyed. And for the first time, I felt almost joyful. The people who had long disregarded me were now having to deal with the fallout from their own bad choices. Furthermore, I was not involved in it. I just let it all happen for a while. I was no longer the problem. I needed to concentrate on my own life. And that's how it was better. Am I being too vindictive to be pleased about this? The third update. Each choice seemed worse than the one before it. She alienated everyone who could have assisted her and wasted money on pointless frivolities. I couldn't deny my parents' foolishness for continuing to indulge her. But I wasn't shocked either. It was inevitable what would happen next. The growing debts, the unpaid but worthless contractors, and the vanishing assets were all publicized, refusing to deal with a sinking ship. A few more companies that had been in the family's portfolio left when the creditors began to show up. My parents' avoidance of phone calls finally reached a breaking point. Bills were piling up. The solicitors took up residence. Naturally, I heard all of this secondhand. The gossip was freely circulated by people I hadn't spoken to in years. Additionally, there appeared to be a new update every other day. However, it wasn't my family's decline in popularity that most affected me. It was the phone call my mother gave me that night. She hadn't even been given the time of day that night, and I hadn't spoken to her since. However, she was phoning me as if nothing had happened, making a vain attempt to sound casual. There was that distinct hint of desperation in her voice. She informed me that they were working on it and that things were getting worse. But she didn't immediately ask for assistance. Rather, she added a flimsy pleas about how they were attempting to make everything better. She didn't have much to say. They were clearly in danger of losing everything. Then, as I had anticipated, the tone changed. As usual, she placed the blame elsewhere. She attempted to give the impression that they were caught off guard by their own choices, as though they simply hadn't anticipated it. She almost tried to guilt-trip me when she said, "You know, we always thought you'd be there for us." I waited for her to get to the point for a long time, and I said nothing. She eventually asked if I could help. Not in a subtle way. Of course, there was a catch. She didn't express gratitude or admit that their bad decisions were the cause of the entire situation. No. She implied that I now owed them money. Do you not have the money? Perhaps you could help the family. Despite my anger, I controlled myself. I just hung up. Avoiding contact with trash was preferable. They had told me to work harder and earn my own success. And I still remembered what they had said. I still remembered how my sister had reveled in her unmerited triumph and how my mother had dismissed me with such ease. My sister then called. Just as I had anticipated, I didn't respond. Although it was similar, there was a hint of manipulation in the voicemail she left. She began by apologizing, saying she had made mistakes due to stress. As an older sister, she confided in me about how bad things had gotten and pleaded with me to take charge and help keep the family from going bankrupt. She even claimed that she was unprepared, that the estate was too much for her, and that perhaps if I assisted her, things could be resolved. She was pleading for the check to be cashed once more. I heard the entire message, and every word was brimming with desperation. I didn't waste time making small talk when I eventually called her number again. That wasn't fair to her. I remained composed. But when I asked if she truly expected me to assist, the disgust in my voice was obvious. Did she really think I'd come in and fix everything after everything that had happened? As usual, she stumbled and tried to play the family card. But I was sick of hearing that bullshit. She had wasted everything that had been given to her, and now she was pleading with me to save her. I reminded her of the words that had stuck with me for so long, and that she had used to dismiss me so readily. She had told me that I didn't deserve anything, and that I should put in more effort. I took offense at the fact that it was now her turn. She attempted to interrupt, but I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I informed her that no one had ever assisted me in my life's work to get to this point. I had had to fight for everything, particularly against her entitlement, selfishness, and all the demands my family made of me because I was poor. She also believed that I would fix it for her when everything was falling apart. That was not going to occur. On the other end of the queue, she sounded frustrated, as though she believed she could coerce me into doing something. She said that the fact that I had the money sitting there implied that I owed her something. I told her exactly what I thought and interrupted her before she could say anything more. Do you believe I owe you something for that? I'm not your backup plan, I said, although I could almost hear her frustration. I wasn't finished yet. I don't owe you anything, and I certainly don't owe you my success. I was clear that I had long since made up my mind, and I wasn't going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Unlike her, I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. So I hung up without saying anything more. The calls continued. My sister, mother, and even some members of my extended family, they all shared the same tale, the same justifications, and the same fervent request for assistance. They were all trying to find someone to blame for their shortcomings. However, I wasn't giving them anything. I stopped answering their calls. I didn't have to. I won't give them a dime in the end. I didn't smell anything, and I didn't feel guilty at all. The fourth update. Everyone was seated in nervous silence, creating a tense atmosphere in the room. Awkward glances were being exchanged between everyone. Since the last family gathering, the dust had not settled. The fallout was still affecting the family. In an attempt to portray themselves as the repentant victims, my parents had been begging me for the past few days. They pleaded for forgiveness, but their appeals were never sincere. My grandfather called a family meeting, just as I was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the cacophony of their demands. He hadn't participated in the mayhem that followed the meal. He had decided to simply watch. It was his turn to talk now. I noticed my parents sitting there, still a little unkempt from the experience. I was certain that we would all remember this conversation. My sister was also present, her face flushed with shame, her eyes darting about, as though a glance would convince everyone to reconsider. As always, Grandpa stood tall and commanding at the front, his keen eyes cutting through the tension. He sat at the head of the table without saying a word, his normally composed manner given a colder, more determined look. I sat down opposite him, unsure of what to anticipate. Nothing with his family was ever simple. As I had discovered by now, Grandpa started off by calmly stating that he was certain we were all curious as to why he had called this meeting, his voice breaking through the uncomfortable silence. He went on to say that it was time for him to make amends. Excuses were no longer an option, as though preparing for combat. My sister crossed her arms more tightly and shifted in her seat. My parents had already exchanged anxious looks with one another. Grandpa went on to say that he had seen my parents make bad choices for far too long, and that my sister was worse than he had expected. He acknowledged that for too long, he had been too forgiving and passive. But that was no longer the case. The words hung heavy and sharp in the air, uncertain of where this was going. I felt as though I was holding my breath. Grandpa's voice became louder, as he announced that he had made the decision to change his will. He stood slowly and gave my parents a stern look before informing us that their inheritance had been withdrawn. The room fell silent, as the words struck with such force. My father's mouth opened, but no words emerged, and my mother's face went white. Their astonishment was obvious. My sister looked from Grandpa to our parents, her face contorted in shock, her mouth ajar a little. Although I had anticipated a significant event, I hadn't anticipated it to unfold in this manner. Grandpa's statement reverberated through the quiet in the room. My sister, who could no longer contain herself, gasped in shock and then blurted out, "How could Grandpa do such a thing?" She insisted that she had done nothing wrong and demanded to know why he was punishing her. Without hesitation, Grandpa interrupted her. She had lived her life acting entitled, thinking that everything was due to her, and my parents had encouraged her selfishness. He said icily. He continued by describing how my parents had created an environment in which I was always expected to prove myself, where my diligence was valued, and where my sister's requests were consistently catered to. His eyes narrowed in rage as he turned to face my parents. His voice was sharp and low. "You didn't help anyone," he said. "Your partiality caused your daughter to become disabled. Additionally, your selfishness has set up your own daughter for failure. The bill is now past due." My mom was using a handkerchief to dab at her eyes. But there was more to the tears than sadness. They came from embarrassment. My father was struggling to find the right words to defend himself. His hands clenched on the table, his knuckles white. Grandpa, however, silenced him, his eyes piercing the room like a knife. With her face flushed with embarrassment and her mouth moving as though she could somehow reverse everything Grandpa had just said. My sister was clearly shaking. However, the words were not flowing, as though she couldn't believe the direction this conversation had taken. She sat in stunned silence, her eyes darting between Grandpa and me. My parents' now shaking voices attempted an apology. Tears were streaming down my mother's face as she apologized and said that they never intended to make me feel inferior. They never wanted things to get this bad. My father muttered, sounding weak for the first time. However, I could see the cruelty in their eyes. So their apologies felt like empty words. All they wanted was to get back in charge of the predicament they had caused. After that, everyone knew better than to pick a side or risk being excluded from the will as well. They sent me a message 2 days later, making one last effort to get my money back. Once more, they expressed regret for their actions and begged for forgiveness. I didn't have to hear it. Though, the words didn't have the same impact as they used to. Even though I had already forgiven them, I still had no intention of reintegrating them into my life. Never. Ever. All I wanted to do was run towards the future. Grandpa had helped me secure and let go of the bitterness that had been with me for so long.